Thank you very much for being prompt and on time, and we don't want to lose a minute of Fred's words of wisdom. I will be very brief. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but I do have to add one piece to the hats that were presented last week, somewhat less than I had anticipated. But one that I was not aware of was that he wore a hat that was the business world. And so I've just asked him if he would briefly fill us in on that. I thought I knew just about all the things that Fred has done in his busy life, but we're going to go on with the idea that he is our speaker of the morning. Thank you, Fred.
Good morning, scholars of Third Reform. I have a habit of calling all of my students scholars because I think very aspirationally. Let's take a moment to pray, shall we? Father God, thank you for this gathering. Thank you for the opportunity, Lord, to speak in your house, to your people, to your children, to my brothers and my sisters. Lord, still our hearts, prepare the way, make us all ready for what you have to deliver in these few words. In the name of the Christ, amen. Now, to pick up on what Peg was talking about, I spent 1 year after the Marine Corps as a parts expediter for General Motors, also known as a parts gopher, and 1 year in the telecommunications industry, and then 13 years in the aerospace industry as a trainer. So while I was at Aircraft Braking Systems, the whole time I was there, I was in graduate school because I found out that the private sector is not what I wanted to do. And so it was a means to an end to get me out of there. When I finally left to come to Hope College, one of my colleagues who had been at the company ragging on me, just criticizing me the whole time about being so crazy as to major in history, he said, the day I left, he said, "So, you're gonna go teach history, huh?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, can you make any money at it?" I said, "Well, I don't know if you could. I'm gonna go find out." This morning we're going to talk about another African American who helped to protect democracy, and that was Frederick Douglass. Now, for a long time, Frederick Douglass has been a person who has just captured my imagination. He's been a hero of mine ever since I read his narrative the first time in senior high school. And if you haven't gotten David Blight's biography of him that came out a couple of years ago, I really recommend that you get the book. So much has been written about Douglass. Hope College has a library on him. My colleague, Dr. Bill Cohen, who preceded me at Hope in the 19th century U.S. position, he was really, really good about getting books for the scholarship on the 19th century. But Frederick Douglass was born in the year 1818. We can switch. And I have question marks around this because Frederick Douglass did not really know the exact year of his birth, the date of his birth. In his narrative, which I'll talk about in just a moment, he says that he saw his mother only 6 times in his life. She lived on a plantation that's several miles away. Usually the only time she could get away to see him was to come late at night, as in the AM hours. Then she had to get up in the AM hours to go back to the plantation because she could not be away from the plantation of her own before sunrise or after sunrise. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out, you all are smart enough, you're experienced enough, you've been around long enough to know the kind of impact that it has on mother-child relationships and a child's development at that early stage of life. But that was the normal routine that went on in that period. And quite frankly, next slide please. People were more diligent about keeping records on their livestock than they were their slaves during the antebellum period. Now, it seems hard to imagine, but you have to, for a moment, take off your 21st century hat and put on your 19th century hat if you can, and just imagine that, yes, these 3 animals, in many cases, were more valuable to an individual slave owner than the human being. And the reason is because, and I kid you not when I say this, there were ongoing, vigorous debates in the 19th century about whether or not black people were actually human among supposed learned people. Now, the mere fact that they're debating this is all that need to be said about that. When somebody is questioning your humanity, what else? I mean, all else falls by the wayside. Let me give you a 20th century example of that. In 1968, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis to support the sanitation workers in that strike, you'll know there's a very famous photograph of these guys marching around with signs that said, "I am a man." Now, he was down there because they were protesting for better work wages, better work hours, and better work conditions. So why didn't they have those placards? Why carry around a sign saying, "I am a man"? I think the answer is this. If you can't wrap your mind around the fact that I'm a human being, first, deserving of good wages and better hours and work conditions, the fact that you cannot embrace my humanity, all the rest of that is just irrelevant at that point. Because you can't even deal with the fact that I am a human being deserving of such things. Because you understand, only human beings deserve good wages, good work hours, and good work conditions. So they said we had to deal with that part first. Let's settle that. If we can agree upon my humanity, then we can talk about the other things: wages, hours, conditions. If that wasn't a question mark in the 20th century, the middle 20th century, and by the way, 1 year before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. If it's a question mark then, roll back 100 years, it's not just a question mark, it's not even a certainty. So, next slide, please. Frederick Douglass is born on the eastern shore of Maryland. Now, you see that part over there? It says Chestertown and Easton. All that area is where I grew up. My stepfather's from Chestertown. When my mother remarried, she moved across the bay. You see the Annapolis and then across the bay, and it's just beautiful. And if you go to the eastern shore of Maryland, the further down south you go, it's like every mile is like driving back another 50 years in time. It's still very rural, very country, and the Southerners over there, they don't even talk like Southerners. Like I'm in a production at the Holland Civic Theater right now, and you can tell every now and then that my accent will come out. There's a line I have to say, "What do you think I'm talking about, you moron?" Well, I know that people in the North call moron, not moron. But on the Eastern Shore, they don't say house, they say hoose. So it's a whole different vernacular, different tone, different intonations. It's a completely different culture, what they call the waterman's culture. Crabbing, seafood, fish, all the things. Plus a lot of chicken factories and so on. So agriculture, very, very beautiful, but still very reminiscent of when Frederick Douglass was born there. Next slide, please. Also, born on the eastern shore of Maryland, just a few miles from him was Harriet Tubman, the very famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. Next slide, please. Now, it just seemed to me appropriate to take a moment to have us just reflect on a time when it is too easy, because we hear about this so often in schools, it's too easy just to kind of and then there was the Underground Railroad. It was just as though there was some type of a natural byproduct of Republican democracy. So let us take time to really drill into what's going on during that century. It's a Republican democracy, and there are people who are literally having to run away from one part of the country to another part of the country to be free. And in most cases, if they really want to be free, they have to run to literally another country to be free. That happened on the regular, on a routine basis. Most of the time when that happened, these are young, single men who know that when they run away, there will be reprisals for their family afterward. And we have been taught that most of the time they ran from south to north, but next slide, please. These two maps that we see of the Underground Railroad show clearly that there were people who ran from south to north, but also from north to south, that is into the Caribbean, to Jamaica, to Bermuda, to Haiti, to South America, to Central America. Let me put it simply for you, okay? Anywhere but here. Because here, there's no guarantee of freedom. You were always on borrowed time. if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, and if you have not seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, I thoroughly recommend that you see it. It's gripping in the most heartbreaking kind of way. You all know there's a great debate on right now on just history in general, and what many people are referring to as critical race theory and so on. About 5 years ago, it was just called American history. We don't want people feeling bad about some parts of history. So the question that I had was, well, then how do you discuss the upside of the Holocaust? There's no way of doing it. And if somebody can, I don't want to associate with them. There are some parts of human history that are just so horrendously bad, there's no way of taking the easy way to the on ramp. But you know what? If we do not engage them directly, forthrightly, and with passion, we are doomed to do it again. Such is the nature of our species. You all know there's a reason why God in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, was real big on memory, saying, here's this thing going on. Be sure you tell your children and your children's children, and they're rising up and sitting down, going out, coming in, before they go to bed, before they wake up in the morning. Tell them so they can remember, and so I don't have to go through this again with you, because you can't go on having a bad habit of forgetting. Next slide, please. This map shows you even more, it was greater detail. So what happened was that when slaves ran away, as Frederick Douglass will eventually do, they ran in every direction, east and west, but most of the time, Eugene D. Genovese, in his book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, wrote that slaves, when they ran away, very often they ran from east to west, not north to south, sometimes from one plantation over to another one, not to get away, but just to find out where mom was sent, where auntie was, where their cousin. In other words, next slide. No matter what direction they went, they were trying to find their family members, which suggests something else to us about the close kinship connections, even under those conditions. Now, the definition of chattel slavery is that it was the first attempt in slavery, modern slavery, where the human being was quite literally, the attempt was to make the human being become a thing. As in, none of you asked for the pew you're sitting on for permission to sit on it. You do with it what you want. It's yours to use, get rid of, dispose of, any way you want. In other words, literally a thing. Which of course set up the conditions for the perverted psychology of American slavery, because every now and then the thing became a sexual object. And if you're going to follow through on the definition of all that, well then, if those things are going on with a thing, you have some other problems that are going on that invite some theological introspection and some biological reduction. Next slide, please. From the very beginning, when America was a young republic, meaning in 1787, when the founding fathers were in Philadelphia, at the time that they were drafting the Constitutional Convention, and I mean at the very moment that they were in the process of debating and drafting and writing the Constitutional Convention, the form of government that we had then before the Constitution was approved in 1789, because they had to write the thing first and send it out to the several states to be looked upon, reviewed, then voted, then ratified. That won't occur until 1789. George Washington's first term is 1789 to 1793, then 1793 to 1797. But the Confederation Congress, that is, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution, they passed legislation for something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They carved out a huge swath of land. Now, this picture all by itself gives you some insight into the psychology of the people of the day. They said, we know that people are going to move west, and because they're going to move west, we are going to need to have this land for the future states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, and to some extent, Minnesota. We're going to set up the rules for which these states will first form a territorial government, then a territorial governor. They'll have to agree to certain things like slavery will be prohibited. There will be freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protections against unlawful search and seizure. In other words, all the things that eventually get drilled down into the first 10 amendments that we know of as the Bill of Rights, these Northwestern territories, in order for them to qualify as states, they say you already have to deny slavery in your area. So political geographers will say that even in 1787, as slavery moved west, it was still being pushed south by fiat of this design. But the main point, though, was that slavery was already moving west. Now, it wasn't just the institution. As the institution moved west, so did the people who ran the institution. And they took with them all their cultural assumptions about black people, about Native Americans, all their prejudices. In other words, the culture moved west as well. So the oppression, the culture, attitudes, the notions of superiority, all that moved west as they moved west. If it had just been the economic moving west, that would have been bad enough. But it's all the cultural baggage that came with it. Next slide, please. So we see this in 1789, when the Constitution is ratified. You see some states that are already joining the Union, like Virginia is moving further west. Then Georgia was pretty big at one point. Next one. And then by 1803, when Napoleon Bonaparte, who comes to power in France in 1799, 1800, he begins his wars of conquest right around 1800, 1801. And by 1803, because war was expensive then and war is expensive today, you know, the thing about soldiers is that they expect to be paid, fed, and armed. Well, that takes money. Warfare is expensive all the time. So to get some currency, some much needed currency, Napoleon decided to sell off the former French territory, the French claim to the middle part of the United States, and it doubled the size of the United States in 1803. You have heard of it as the Louisiana Purchase. Next one, please. And the institution of slavery kept moving further and further west. Now, what happens is that as slavery moved west, big plantation owners who were growing cotton at this point on an annual basis, they didn't have the knowledge to rotate crops. So they plant a crop and then harvest it, then plant a crop and harvest it, then plant a crop and harvest it, and plant a crop and harvest it until the soil gets exhausted. So because of soil exhaustion, they have to literally move west. And they're not going to stop growing cotton because, let me just put it simply for you, the Southerners, not the Northerners, not the Egyptians, not the Indians, not the British, Southerners were the ones who said cotton made them king. They called it King Cotton. It made them so wealthy. I mean, wealthy to the point, I'm talking about like Bill Gates wealthy, Jeff Bezos, Amazon wealthy, super duper wealthy per the 19th century. This isn't small wealth, this is huge, out of your mind wealth. And with that kind of wealth, there's no incentive at all for them to stop growing cotton. So they kept planting it and planting it and planting it, and as it moved further west, they pushed poor whites who could not afford slaves and big plantation operations further west, and those poor whites settled in places like southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois. If you go to those states today, I promise you, in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, you will find a distinctly southern culture there. And in Indiana's case, it takes up pretty much a big part of the state. Indiana during the 1920s and 30s had more Ku Klux Klansmen than Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. No southern state had as many Ku Klux Klansmen as the state of Indiana did. And Michigan had its fair share too. Michigan went one step further and had something called the Black Legion, which was an organization founded by dentists in southern Ohio who thought that the Ku Klux Klan wasn't doing a good enough job of harassing Catholics, Jews, blacks, and immigrants. Next slide, please. By 1819, the country has expanded this far. You see the former Louisiana Territory. Now there's the Missouri Territory. And something happened in 1819 because now, according to the rules, Missouri had formed a territorial governor. They had a territorial government. They applied for admission to the Union of States. And there was a representative from Pennsylvania, James Talmadge, who said, okay, Missouri, you want to join the Union? Fine, we'll let you join. Well, except there's these two things. You must, first of all, and you want to come in to the Union as a slave state. Now, here's the situation. In 1819, there were 11 slave states and 11 free states. So that meant 22 senators from the North, 22 senators from the South. Now, nobody's really worried about the House of Representatives because the House of Representatives is based on population, so the numbers will fluctuate from election to election anyway. But the Senate is where the real power was held. As long as you had an even number of senators and an even number from free and slave states, you had the balance of power. But if Missouri came in as a slave state, they would give 2 more senators from the South. It would be 24 to 22. And James Talmadge sweetened it up, guaranteed to make a controversy by saying, listen, Missouri, if you come into the Union, you got to come in As a slave state, you must promise to, first off, not bring any more slaves into your state. You have the ones that you have in there right now, and the ones that are there right now, if they're below the age of 25, when they need to be the age of 25, you must manumit them. That is, set them free. Well, James Thomas knew that nobody's going to go for this, right? So it set off a firestorm of debate, which is exactly what he wanted to do. So the great debate that was about slavery, and look, this just took an already simmering problem and had it boil over. Next slide, please. Now, while this big debate was going on, should Missouri become a slave state versus a free state? Next one, please. Way back in the East, in the state of Virginia. Next one. On a very nice piece of territory called Monticello. Next one. Next. One. There, Thomas Jefferson, who now had been retired from the presidency. Now, Thomas Jefferson was the president from 1801 to 1809. It's now 1819. So Jefferson has been out of office for 10 years. And Jefferson is not as old as he's going to get, but he's not as young as he used to be. And hearing this debate going on, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his friend John Holmes. I won't read the whole letter, but Thomas Jefferson said, next one. In that letter, he said, when it comes to the issue of slavery, I fear that we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Now, the thing to note here, it would have been one thing if Thomas Jefferson said, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can't let him go, but he qualified it, didn't he? He said, we cannot safely let him go. What this meant was, you can let him go if you want, but you won't be safe. So if you want to be safe, guess what you got to do? Stand there and keep on holding the wolf by the ears. Now, America may have had black people in bondage, but guess who else was in bondage? In 1819, the entire country. Thomas Jefferson, in that same letter, forecasted his fears about the possibility of civil war. Now look, Thomas Jefferson has been called the American Sphinx. He's kept historians busy for decades trying to figure out who was he, how could he write such wonderful words in the Declaration of Independence and still own slaves, the whole thing with Sally Hemings, his denial of the children and so on. Look, as one of the founding fathers, I wish that Thomas Jefferson had not owned slaves. I really do wish that, but he did. There's nothing to be done about it right now. But the language he put into the Declaration of Independence is not worth throwing out. This right here shows that Thomas Jefferson was just a regular human being that had some inconsistencies, and the wolf had him by the short collar too. Next one, please. In 1831, Missouri will come into the Union as a free state, rather a slave state. So Missouri comes in as a slave state, and in 1831, this gentleman right here, William Lloyd Garrison, next slide. In 1831, he publishes his first issue of a paper called the Liberator newspaper. And in that paper, he says, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. This was the first major statement from an abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, and this would go on for the next 2-3 decades. Now listen, William Lloyd Garrison, quite frankly, any abolitionist in the 19th century was taking their lives into their hands to say this. This was the economy of the United States. I read some material that said that by the start of the Civil War in 1860, never mind the cotton, just the human value of slaves was somewhere around $10 billion. Human beings, especially in this country, have never walked away from that kind of wealth voluntarily. So when you're going to threaten that kind of wealth, you can believe in a day and time we don't have the kind of laws that we do today that presumably protect people from hate crimes and so on, that they're not going to let that stand. So William Lloyd Garrison was flying directly against the current of the way things in society was. This was an institution that made America wealthy. Abraham Lincoln, in 1865, on March 4th, 1865, during his second inaugural address, will say that the bondsman's 250 years, by his count, 250 years has supplied the wealth of the United States. This is the President of the United States who's coming face to face with the fact that the nation's wealth has been on the backs of people called slaves. Next slide, please. In 1838, Frederick Douglass managed to escape. Now, he'll eventually connect with William Lloyd Garrison at an anti-slavery meeting, and then when people find out at one meeting, Garrison's going to ask Douglass to speak, since Douglass is an escaped slave. He's going to ask Douglass to speak, and there will be people in the room, and these are the allies, the good guys, who will think that it's not really Douglass talking, but a parrot speaking, because they cannot conceive of the fact that a black man could actually be as eloquent and as educated and as intelligent as Frederick Douglass. So literally, a creature with a bird brain will be smarter than he was. Next slide, please. Now, Frederick Douglass is helped in his escape by Anna Murray, who he eventually marries. She's from the Eastern Shore of Maryland as well. She's a very dutiful woman. She gives him 5 children. She makes it very possible for Frederick Douglass to do what he does. She's a good wife for him. Next slide, please. So Douglass and Garrison, they join forces for a while. They'll eventually split because, see, Frederick Douglass, and we'll find this later on with his association with John Brown, the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, as a man, as a black man who's been not just inside of slavery, but has been a slave. He got the stripes on his back from being whipped. He's got the scars and the bruises and the spirit from being inside that system. He knows what the folk who are benefiting from, he knows what they're prepared to do to maintain it and keep it. They're not gonna let it go. And so Douglass is into something, rather, Garrison is into something called moral suasion. We're going to appeal to their moral goodness. Well, okay, you can do that, but from somebody that's been inside that system, Frederick Douglass knows that morality has many faces, as we shall see shortly. Next slide, please. So from 1834 to 1836, the system of slavery keeps spreading further west, and now Frederick Douglass is an abolitionist. He's speaking to crowds and audiences. Sometimes he gets pelted with eggs and bricks and all kinds of things. They're, of course, calling him names. Look, he's a black man in the 19th century. He'll eventually have to leave the country and go to England on a speaking tour to raise money to pay his former master to leave him alone, because the master says, you took your labor from me, and I want my money's worth. That's the only way this guy finally leaves him alone. Next slide, please. And it keeps spreading further and further west. Now, yes, that red, gray area over there that you see, now the Mexicans think that belongs to them. Don't worry, we'll put that myth to rest in just a moment. Next slide, please. In 1845, Frederick Douglass at this point would be about, what, 29 years old? So he publishes his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And it is, if you have not read it, it's only about that thick. If you haven't read it, what? How can I say this with urgency? Read it now. It's one of the great pieces of American literature. Next. And in that narrative, Frederick Douglass says, he tells about the account that he had one day as a child, whereas the wife of his master was teaching him how to read when the master came home. And he said, very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful. Okay. Unlawful as well as unsafe. Now, Frederick Douglass is a child. He's a black child. Mr. Auld is let's consider this. He's an adult. That's one level of authority. 2, he's a white adult. That's 2 levels of authority. 3, he's male. That's 3 levels of authority. 4, he's a slave owner. He's got 4 levels of authority over this black kid that he literally owns. And he's unsafe because he learned to read the ABC. Now, Frederick Douglass, naturally being gifted and intelligent, he always was a precocious kid. But hearing this, as he's approaching his teenage years, he's hearing this go on because, of course, they always talked about the slave, even though the person standing right there, as though they weren't there and were too stupid to understand what was being said. Next slide, please. So it was a dumb law, an unjust law, a stupid law, but it was the law. Then he said, to use his own words, further he said, if you give him an inch, he will take an L. He should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. If you teach him how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable. And here's the whole point of it all. Of no value to his own, that is of no value to me. It was always about me. People talk about narcissism today, really? So you don't want this kid to learn how to read, because if he learns how to read, it means he'll be less able to serve you. Well, Frederick Douglass reflected on that. Next slide, please. And he said, so as he's standing there listening to this conversation between this husband and his wife, knowing this man, he's a male, he's white, slave owner, and an adult. I'm just a child, and yet me learning how to read the ABCs is scaring him out of his mind. Words, learning how to read is scaring this adult man who owns me. Whatever it is that's causing this, I got to do more of it. So he says, these words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. What that last sentence says is that prior to this encounter, Frederick Douglass, the precocious, very intelligent kid who will go on to be a magnificent speaker, orator, abolitionist, suffragist, everything else, what he's telling us is that for the whole time of his life, he has known his condition, but something inside of him, intellectually, spiritually, something kept telling him, this is not right. I know they keep telling me this is my natural condition, but something had been stirring inside of me, slumbering, trying to find its way through the fog, trying to find its way through the haze, trying to find its way through the oily mirror. You know, this cannot be the way it's supposed to be. And this conversation cleared all that away. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things, the fog, the oily mirror. Dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding I had struggled, but struggled in vain. Up until now, it had been no progress. But now I finally understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty. To wit, I now understood Mr. All's ability, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Sure, chains were part of it. Sure, whips were part of it. Sure, the system was part of it. All that was true. But what Frederick Douglass is saying, your power to enslave him was because you kept my mind in the dark. So if you're thinking logically, if I free this, the body will follow. Like my wrestling coach used to say, grab their head, the rest of them will follow. There was nothing that you could do to keep this kid away from a book. Anything that he wanted to read, he made it his mission to learn how to read, deducing correctly that if he freed this, freedom would come to his body. I submit to you all that today, when you hear, I told people on campus that whenever I hear people running around talking about, oh, don't worry, you don't need a college education, or you should just, you don't need a college education, I always ask this question, whose children are you saying that to? Because my guess is there are a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs that are sending their kids to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. They're not telling them to not go to college. They've already got it made, so why don't, if they're going to go to college, and they're part of a wealthy family, why are you telling some people's children that and not other people's children? I mean, just ask them. Next slide, please. So Frederick Douglass also said at the end of his narrative, he said, I find since reading over the foregoing narrative that I have in several instances spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion. He was very hard on religion. He hated religious slaveholders. There's a difference between a religious slaveholder and a slaveholder who follows after Christ. First off, in his viewpoint, if you follow after Christ, you don't own slaves. But there were some who did. So he said, I have in several instances spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. To remove that liability of such misapprehension, I deem it proper to append the following brief explanation. So just to get it clear, even though I have been deaf on religion and slaveholders throughout my entire narrative, just to clear this up, let me share with you the following. At the end of his narrative, he says this. Next. He said, when I speak of Christianity, when I say respecting Christianity and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity. To reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all labels. Never was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil in. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate with the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible certain inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. Thanks, Jeff. So, also in Frederick Douglass's narrative, he said there's one other thing. He says in that narrative. Now, you might think that for a black man or woman in the 19th century in America, what could be more miserable than being a slave if you're alive? He says, well, there is one other thing that is worse than being a slave. He said, because he says in his narrative, of all the things that could befall me, if I ever found myself a slave again, there's one thing that would be worse than becoming a slave again, and that is to become the slave of a religious slave master. He said they are the most base, the most cruel, the most inhuman. The ones calling themselves Christian slave masters, they're the worst ones, the religious ones. And on he went. That was Frederick Douglass, speaking truth to that power. Next one, please. In 1846 to 1848, Mexico and the United States will fight a war called the Mexican-American War next. And it's a brilliant military operation. I won't go into it because I want to make sure we have some time for questions. Next, please. America wins, Mexico loses. And yeah, if you look at that map on the right, all that territory today the western part of the United States, yeah, that was all Mexico. So the Mexicans, that was theirs. They lost it through warfare. Next. And then the crisis, like Missouri, over the future state of California, will it come into the Union as a slave or free state? And so, next please. The same debate arose. Will it come in a slave or free? Next. The system had literally spread as far west as the Mexican Cession. The interesting thing was that the people in Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1821, but because Texas was such a big area, they started encouraging American settlers. Now, my colleague, Bill Cohen, used to sit up and say to me, you think that these guys would have looked at what happened to the Native Americans? They're like, well, you stay right over there. But they invited them in, they brought with them their slaves, and even though Mexico, the nation, had outlawed slavery, American settlers wanted to have their slaves recognized as their private property. The Mexicans said no. Then the Americans said, like, okay, well, we're going to declare independence. And the Mexicans went, you're crazy, this is our country, you can't declare independence. No, we're going to do it anyway. Well, you can see how that ended up going, right? Next one, please. So is it going to be a slave state or a free state? Yes or no? Next. So they debated in the Congress through July and August of 1850. The next, in September 9th, 1850, California came into the Union as a free state. Southerners were furious about this, but they had something that the Congress gave them that helped to sweeten the deal. Next. Several things. First off, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. New Mexico was granted territorial status. Slave trading was abolished in Washington, D.C. Look, if you've been in Washington, D.C., you know that all you got to do is cross the bridge into Arlington in Virginia. If you don't, so no trading in Washington, D.C., go across the bridge, buy one, bring it back. So it doesn't get rid of the system, just the trading. Next. Then in 1852, Frederick Douglass is asked to give a 4th of July oration. Now, you have to ask yourself, whose idea was this? To ask an ex-slave to give a speech on the 4th of July. All right. Well, Frederick Douglass never missed an opportunity. He said, fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. Next, please. But such is not the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I'm not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in the joyous anthems were inhuman, mockery, and sacrilegious irony. Do you citizens mean to mock me by asking me to speak today? Next, please. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing there, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Next, please. In 1859, Frederick Douglass, who knows about Captain John Brown on the right, John Brown will request for him to go to a meeting in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, just a few miles away from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. There, John Brown's going to say, listen, Douglass, I have this idea to seize the weapons at a place called Harper's Ferry. It's one of 3 state-of-the-art weapons manufacturing facilities in the country. The plan is to seize the weapons, distribute them to slaves in the area and sympathetic whites, and begin a guerrilla war that will last as long as it takes to crush the spine of slavery. They spend a few hours talking about this. Douglass says, I'm sorry, I can't join you. Come, Douglass. Surely with you with us, it'll rally people to our cause. And Douglass says, no, I'm not going to join you. The reason why is because Frederick Douglass was a black man who had been a slave and hated slavery, but he had been on the inside of it and knew what people were prepared to do to maintain it. Frederick Douglass knew that you can't break slavery's spine with a guerrilla war. He knew that to get rid of it, there were going to be a lot of people who would have to, in other words, they were prepared to literally die by the hundreds of thousands to maintain the system. And a mere raid was not going to do it. So John Brown hated slavery too, but he hated it as a white man from the outside who had come through Michigan, of all places, and had seen a black kid who was owned by a master get hit upside the head with an iron pan when he was only 12 years old. That traumatized him. From that day forward, he hated slavery and everything it stood for and the people who practiced it. John Brown said, I'm going to do this anyway. Next, please. They had the meeting. They went their separate ways. Next. On October 16, 1859, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry. John Brown was not a military man, he was a poor planner. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong and quickly. The raid failed, and John Brown was arrested, taken 12 miles down the road to Charlestown, where he was imprisoned. And ironically enough, he wanted to bring all of this attention to slavery, but in his failure, he ended up getting more attention because people from around the country started coming to interview him, and he got his word out through the newspapers. Next. John Brown was sentenced to die. Now, to give you an idea, you talk about if you want to, there's always, of course, many, but one example of political spinelessness was James Buchanan, the 15th president of the United States. John Brown raided a federal armory, but instead of having the federal government try his case, James Buchanan, the president, let the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, do it. Knowing that if Virginia tried John Brown, Virginia, a slave state, a state that by 1800 was exporting black people as slaves throughout the rest of the Union, he knew he would be guaranteed to be found guilty, but he did it to mollify, to appease Southerners. And John Brown was convicted and sentenced to die by hanging. On December 2nd, 1859, as John Brown was being led to the gallows, that's a very famous romanticized picture of him coming out of the courthouse, the jailhouse, and kisses this black kid. I do not know that really happened. It's just a very sweet-looking picture. But John Brown did, however, before he was hung, before they put the noose around his neck, he handed his jailer a note that said, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And then he went to join his fathers. Next, please. The following year, Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States in November. The following month, December, South Carolina announced its intention to leave the Union, that is secession. By April of the following year, the United States would be in a state of civil war, when on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on the federal fort at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Next. The Civil War was on. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He will eventually emancipate people through the Emancipation Proclamation. He will give a very moving second inaugural address. But Abraham Lincoln was who he was. That is, he was a white guy in the 19th century. He will eventually come around, but he comes to the abolitionist party rather late. He gets there. Early on, Abraham Lincoln is not exactly sure that black people and white people can inhabit the same space in America. He is a member of the American Colonization Society, which was formed in 1816 to deport all black people back to Africa. I cannot stress to you enough the deeply held belief that this could not be a multiracial society where two different groups of people could exist in peace and productivity side by side. Next slide, please. But Frederick Douglass was in Lincoln's ear all the time about the use of black troops. You have got this reserve of manpower, which is uniquely motivated to fight, because they, more than anyone, know that this is a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally, to once and for all, to please God, get rid of slavery once and for all. And they know that if we fail here, they know what the future holds for them because they've been living it in their past. And they cannot fail. This is the one opportunity. And it's also the one proof that we see right now that Southerners are quite literally to fight and die for this institution. Use them. Use us. Next, please. If you look on the faces of these men, their faces, their expressions tell you all you need to know about what they're prepared to do. Next, please. And then there's so much that goes on. On July 18th, 1863, if you have never seen the movie Glory, please watch it. So at the 54th Massachusetts, what they call the USCT, United States Colored Troops, on July 18th, 1863, here's how this worked. From July 1 through 4, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg took care of the Army of Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee's army will never pose the kind of threat that it does to the North, and it means that the North has finally turned the corner on having some good news in this conflict called the Civil War. In that same 4 days, Ulysses S. Grant, further out west, seizes Vicksburg and frees up the Mississippi River. Now the Mississippi River is Vicksburg, the citadel on the Mississippi. Without the Mississippi River and without Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, without Robert E. Lee in the East and the West are now being circled by the Union Army. The thing is going the way the North wants it to go. And then a week after the victory at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, in New York City, not Biloxi, Mississippi, not Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, a riot breaks out. It's the worst race riot of the 19th century. Not one of, it's the worst race riot of the 19th century, where draft officers who are telling people, we need you to join the Union Army, there was a dock strike going on, and people did not like the idea that the war was now being fought to end slavery, They essentially said, look, we didn't get into this to free them to come up here and take our jobs. So for the next 7 or 8 days, it was mayhem in New York City with a children's orphan asylum being burnt, people being hung from lampposts. Any white person trying to hit a black person, they pounced on them too. And while that's going on, several hundred miles further south, at a place called Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts United States Colored Troops, they got up on this particular morning, and they had been told by General Strong, we had to take out Fort Wagner because this fort has been shelling Union shipping off the coast. So we get up there, we seize the fort, we take care of that problem, ships can pass safely. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, commander of the 54th Massachusetts, talked to his men. They all said, we want to do this. The plan was to do a frontal assault to a running through sand with swamp on the right flank, ocean on the left flank. They're going to run in sand in July wearing heavy wool uniforms with heavy muskets in the middle of July in South Carolina, up a hill into Union musket and artillery fire, knowing. You don't have to be a military genius to know that if you a frontal assault into musket fire, you are guaranteed to die. And they did it anyway. Now, in all my research, I tried to find out why did these men do this, for what military value was it, and I haven't found anything. So here's what I've chosen to believe. I think these men, these black men that people dismiss their intelligence, their humanity, I think that on July 18th, 1863, they got together and they said to themselves, we're going to die today. We know this is our day. Who gets to choose their time of death? They chose their time of death. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do this because up to this point, they meaning Northerners, still don't think we have the courage, the intelligence, the fortitude to be good soldiers. Even though we fought in the Revolution, the War of 1812, even though we fought in every battle, every war they've ever had, they don't think we can do. We got to go back and reprove ourselves one more time. So we're going to do this. In other words, we're going to lay down this carpet of blood today. We're going to join our ancestors today, because if we do this today, for the possibility, the hope, not the guarantee, because nothing can be guaranteed in this country, for the possibility that our great-great-grandchildren will at least have a chance. If we do this today, if we give them that carpet of blood, I at least know my great-great-grandchild, not yet born, will have a fighting chance. And so they did. More than half, well over half, of the 54th Massachusetts was wiped out. If you're a military commander today and you lose that many of your troops, you're going to get court-martialed and spend some time in jail. Over 50% casualties, as in KIA, killed in action. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the white commander from Massachusetts, his mother and father were abolitionists. His parents asked for his body to be, they wrote Richmond and asked for the body to be sent back, and Richmond responded back to his parents in Massachusetts, we had buried him with his N-words. Well, strangely enough, the South had just participated in an integrated cemetery. You see, because in the 19th century, it was against the law to bury black people and white people together, as if somehow you're a threatened death. I've always said that the way people treat you in death gives you an insight on how they treated you in life. Next, please. Abraham Lincoln will eventually come around. He, of course, signs the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure. But then by the time he gets to March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the thing I give Abraham Lincoln credit for is that he grew. He grew from where he was in the middle of the 19th century to, by the end of his life, he was more accurately positioned in the middle of the 20th century as a change agent. Abraham Lincoln, and what, isn't that the most we can ask for any of us? To grow in our journey, keep on growing, change your mind about stuff you used to hold this idea about. So on his second inaugural, Abraham Lincoln takes some time on March 4th, 1865, and he says, during one part of his second inaugural address, he's doing all the stuff, like he says, when we were here 4 years ago, you all knew what was going on. I'm not going to go through all that. Then he says, it may seem strange for any man to ask a just God's assistance in helping to wring his bread from the sweat of another man's brow. It's like Abraham Lincoln had stepped outside of himself for just a moment and was musing and doing some exegesis of the entire situation. It may seem strange that any man would dare to ask. It would be one thing if he said God's assistance, but he qualified it. He said to ask a just God's assistance. In other words, Abraham Lincoln is showing that he knew that first off, there's a God out there who knows the difference between justice and injustice, right and wrong, good and bad, up and down, favor and disfavor. You're going to ask that God, who's been obsessed about justice for as long as we have heard and read and known about him. Injustice against his people, the Hebrews, as slaves in Egypt. Injustice committed by the Philistines against them. Injustice against the Amalekites, the Assyrians. Anybody that's harmed his folk, he's always come to their assistance. He comes to the assistance. He sent his son because somebody said justice on earth. He said, I want you to take care of the widow, feed the orphan, take care of the homeless. Why? Because they're the outsiders. They're the ones on the margin. You are being unfair, unjust to them. And Abraham Lincoln is saying, you want that God who gave of himself in the cause of justice to help you wring your bread from the sweat of other men's faces? Do you know who you're talking to? Do you understand who you're dealing with? You really can't be serious. Or you're just that ignorant. But then he said, let us judge not, lest we be judged. The purposes of the Almighty, they have their own definition. Well, that's March 4th. Just over a month later, he'll join his fathers as well. Next one, please. On April 9th, 1865, the Civil War ends. Robert E. Lee signs the surrender document to Ulysses S. Grant. Instead of going to jail, Robert E. Lee, the Supreme Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, will eventually get a job as the university president of Washington and Lee College. Never mind the fact that he waged 4 years of warfare upon his Constitution. Next one. Frederick Douglass, toward the end of his life, his wife Anna Murray dies in 1882, and he had been working with a young secretary named Helen Pitts. And in 1884, after about a year of depression, he will marry his secretary. This will cause a great firestorm of, people don't like it in the 19th century. Folks in the black community don't like it, people in the white community don't like it. Next one, please. Frederick Douglass will, when asked about this, will say, this proves I am impartial. My first wife was the color of my mother, second the color of my father. You know, I like to think I had courage like Frederick Douglass. I'm afraid I fall short, though. I don't know how a man like that survives in the 19th century. I don't know how you do it. But I must tell you that there have been plenty of times when I'm having a pity party, and sadly I have very many of them, that I think about this man, what he went through, what the opportunities that he didn't have, what he did with so little, how he literally made bricks without straw. And when I think about Frederick Douglass, that's like, okay, pity party over. Do have one, have fun, but then get up and get back to work. Because that's what he did every time. This man truly, I think, legitimately helped to protect American democracy at a time when many people were not interested in that. He did it at a time when people like him and people that will come after him who know what it's like to not have democracy, no matter what you call it, in the ecosystem, when you don't have it, you embrace it, you protect it, you perpetuate it. Thank you very much.